Our next speaker is Jeff Martin. Most of you will know him because he's the lead programmer of this event. Jeff is an archivist and a conservator with experience in caring both for archival collections and time-based media art. He is a 2005 graduate of the New York University's Moving Image Archiving and Preservation program. And in 2007, he was the recipient of a postgraduate research fellowship from the Smithsonian to assess the time-based art in the collection of this Hirshhorn Museum. Today, he's a contract conservator here. He currently serves as the executive director of IMAP, Independent Media Arts Preservation. He supervised preservation content for the online media art resource developed by Electronic Art Intermix and IMAP. And his work has been published in The Moving Image, the Journal of the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts, and the anthology Teen Television, Essays on Programming and Fandom. Before attending NYU, Jeff worked as a television documentary writer and producer, and as footage research director for the WPA Film Library. Welcome, Jeff. Actually, I'm just going to say, Jeff is doing some very important ground-laying work for the rest of the symposium, because he's introduced us to all the basic terminology and the basics of film, basically. So the following talks will be based on Jeff's introductions, his technological overview. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, and thanks, Joanna. While I'm setting this up, and I promise that I got a lot of practice with Carrie, so this shouldn't take very long. There's a few other thanks I want to make. First of all, we also want to thank for funding some Smithsonian internal funding through the Grand Challenge Award through the Consortia for Valuing World Cultures and the Consortium for the American Experience. And I also want to thank some people here, specifically here at the Hirshhorn, who have really done an amazing job with some last-minute things. Pam Johnson in the Conservation Department, Bridget Ventura, financial specialist, Christy Mathias, and Bob Strauss in graphic design for the program. We've had a lot of really great support, and I want to thank them. And I am giving the technological overview. I'm going to be talking about two very broad aspects of projected film and slides with some historical context about their development. The physical properties of the film and slides, and also their process of production, specifically concentrating on film. I'll be spending more time on film because it's more complex and offers more variation, and also because I know that our presenters later today will be delving more deeply into slides and the current status of them and their status in the future. Of course, the earliest projected photographic images were glass lantern slides like this one in the late 19th and early 20th century, but I will be talking today about images on film. Film, of course, being a photographic emulsion on a flexible plastic base. The emulsion carries the photographic information, and as you can see here, the thickness of film, which is not very thick, is primarily made up of the base. The emulsion layer is less than 10% of the thickness, and as little as roughly 3%, which makes it particularly vulnerable. The thinness of it is part of the reason for film's fragility. The two sides can usually be identified visually. In black and white film, the base is shiny and the emulsion side is dull. It can be more difficult to identify the base and emulsion sides of color film, but you can generally see something of a textured appearance to the emulsion side. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a few minutes. So the first characteristic of film and slides is the film base itself, the plastic. And since film was introduced in the 1880s, three basic types have been used: cellulose nitrate, cellulose acetate, and polyester. Cellulose nitrate, which is a bit of a tongue twister, so I'll slow down a little bit, was introduced in the 1880s for still photo negatives, and later was introduced for motion picture negatives and prints. It had excellent visual quality. It was durable and scratch resistant, which was the reason that it was particularly favored and has a real reputation for visual quality. The problem with cellulose nitrate, of course, is well known to be highly flammable and subject to decomposition. And I think, however, that those two properties have been a bit exaggerated. It's stable when it's in good condition as long as it's not exposed to flame. And there are a lot of nitrate films that are still in really good shape after as much as 100+ years, although you do see here the final stages of nitrate decomposition on the left, and on the right an image from a decomposing nitrate film. It was discontinued in most countries around the world by the early 1950s. Cellulose acetate was introduced in the 1920s. Initially, it was a cellulose diacetate and later a cellulose triacetate base as a base for amateur use in situations where nitrate's flammability would have presented a safety hazard. It's known colloquially broadly as safety film. It is not particularly dimensionally stable over time if not stored in good cold, dry conditions. This is looking down at a reel of film that is subject to so-called vinegar syndrome, which has resulted in shrinkage and warping and breakage. It gets its name from the vinegary smell that is a result of the off-gassing of acetic film acid from the film base. This is a decomposition mechanism common to photographic negatives, slides, early videotape and audio tape that is on acetate base, as well as motion picture film. The effects of vinegar syndrome and decomposition, even when it's mild to moderate, as seen here, results in problems during projection with prints and also results in issues such as instability and picture focus issues when it's being duplicated for preservation. Polyester was introduced for motion picture film was introduced for film in the mid-1950s for non-motion picture and specialty applications, and it now sees wide use in motion picture film. It is very dimensionally stable over time. It is not flammable. It is extremely strong, so strong that if it jams in a projector, it may damage the projection equipment before the film actually gives way and tears. So those are the three primary bases. And if you're working in this context of projected film and slide art, you will be dealing with acetate and polyester, simply because of the nature and time period of the works we're talking about. The second factor in understanding film is the gauge or format. Technically, gauges refers only to the width of the film stock itself. Format refers to additional factors such as orientation of the frame, which we'll get to, but the two terms are often used interchangeably. There have been dozens of formats used over the years. Perhaps a dozen saw some wide use over a course of time. Some did not, Cinerama, seen here, being one of them. The four most common over time, and the four that we'll be talking about for the next 2 days, in order of introduction, are 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, Super 8, 8 millimeter, and Super 8. And here's a slightly closer view of them here, so you can get a sense of the relative size of the film and the relative area of the picture information of the three. In talking about gauges and formats as far as slides, the single most common by far slide format is 35 millimeter, the technical name for which is the 135 format. 35 millimeter slide originals are reversal film, that is, the original that comes out of the camera is a positive rather than a negative. An important thing to think about in terms of gauges and formats is the difference between a 35 millimeter film and a 35 millimeter slide. They're both referred to colloquially as just 35 millimeter, but as you can see from this diagram, on the left, that slide, although this is negative, the format is exactly the same. The slide is a horizontal orientation that is 8 perforations across lengthwise on the film. Motion picture film uses an image of roughly the same shape, but it's oriented crosswise on the film with an area that is 4 perforations high. There have been other formats over time, a number of somewhat common square formats that Jeffrey and Doug will be touching on in their presentation later today. So to go through the film gauges, 35 millimeter was developed by the Edison Company in the 1890s and was the de facto theatrical gauge for more than a century. It became known as standard gauge for this reason, and has been produced in nitrate, acetate, and polyester base, and has been a format for shooting, for editing, and for film exhibition. And you see here a still from Morgan Fisher's film Standard Gauge, which is about standard gauge film. It has also been used occasionally in film installation artworks, but its size and expense makes that a relatively rare occurrence. The next format is one that we will be dealing with quite a bit today and tomorrow, is 16 millimeters, seen here in a number of variations. The two on the left are sound, the one on the right is silent. 16 was introduced in 1923 by Kodak as a home and amateur format. It was never made in nitrate for safety reasons, and in fact, that is the reason that it's not 17.5. It's not 35 millimeters split in half in order to discourage people from splitting 35 and making nitrate home movies, the dangers of which can be imagined. From the 1920s through the 1980s, 16 millimeter was used in a vast array of applications: home movies, educational, industrial films, combat photography, distribution of television commercials to stations and syndicated television, kinescopes, documentary production, artist films, microfilm in some cases. It is still in a relatively wide use in the museum context. 16 is by far the most common format for film installations today, as seen here. 8 millimeter was introduced in 1932 by Kodak as an amateur format. It's now known as regular 8 simply to differentiate it from Super 8, although it wasn't known that at the time. The large perforations relative to the film's width mean that it has a relatively small and low resolution image. It saw a very limited amount of sort of educational and industrial applications, primarily in the 60s, and was used by young, emerging, and sort of lower budget and underground artists like the Kuchars, especially in the 60s. But in general, this was not an exhibition format outside of the home. And then Super 8 was introduced by Kodak in 1965 as an amateur format. Smaller sprocket holes meant that the same width of stock could hold a larger and higher resolution image. It remained a relatively popular amateur format and still is available in that context, but is also widely used by artists and experimental filmmakers, in addition to even seeing some industrial uses and a brief stint being marketed as a TV news format with magnetic sound, which you can see on the edge of the Super 8 frame on the left. The third distinguishing characteristic of film, motion picture specifically, is the aspect ratio. This is the ratio of the height to width of the projected image. For many years, the standard aspect ratio was 1 to 137, the so-called Academy ratio. The ratio of height and width of the projected image, which I believe I have actually punctuated improperly here, I apologize for that, initially was 1 to 133, which took up the entire space between the film sprockets, but when the soundtrack was added in the late 1920s, more on that in a minute, the image was shrunken slightly, and the resulting 137 aspect ratio was standard until the 1950s. Everything we'll be seeing today and tomorrow on 35 and 16 will be in 137 for 35 millimeter and 133 for 16. In the 1950s, though, the battle against TV brought the widescreen format becoming, over the course of the following decade, the standard for theatrical motion pictures. There were new formats developed like 70 millimeter and Cinerama, but the most successful utilized existing 35 millimeter film with modifications. The image was widened through cropping, or the image was widened through the use of an anamorphic lens. Cropping simply means that a standard 137 image was shot and then masked or cropped in printing or projection. So this is a full frame image from Dr. Strangelove as it was shot. This is a 166 image of the same frame as it would have been cropped in projection initially. With certain filmmakers like Kubrick, there's always a debate about what is really the proper aspect ratio. And there was a particular problem in the mid-1950s during the transition from standard to widescreen projection. In Europe today, the cropped format is usually 166. In America, for whatever reason, it's 185. Anamorphic aspect ratio is a wide angle of view is squeezed by a specially designed lens onto the relatively square image area of standard 35mm film or 16mm film. Corresponding lenses then unsqueeze the image into a wide on-screen aspect ratio when projected. Here's an example of a 35mm anamorphic print. You can see that the image is squeezed vertically. And here's a sort of approximation of that in shooting and projection. The initial trade name for the process was Cinemascope. Films, although they don't use Cinemascope technology anymore, are still referred to as being in scope a lot of times. And non-anamorphic films are often referred to as being flat. So this is an approximation of how the image would appear on the print. The lens simply stretches it to aspect ratio of 2:3:5. It is used in 16 and non-theatrical exhibitions. Tacit Dedine's Fernsehturm is, in fact, a 16mm anamorphic scope installation piece. The next distinguishing characteristic of motion picture film, at least, is sound. In very brief, because this is something that could be the subject, as are pretty much everything we're talking about, the subject of an entire day-long two-day workshop in and of itself. The soundtrack is literally a track, and the thing to keep in mind is that in contrast to the intermittent motion of the image, the track is continuous. Soundtracks may be optical or magnetic. Analog soundtracks may be. Optical tracks seen on the left, on the far left you can see the optical track. They record sound through variations in the amount of light recorded onto the photographed image. Magnetic tracks record sound on a magnetic strip, as seen on the right, that's akin to audio tape that has been applied to the surface of the film. Digital soundtracks used in theatrical exhibition encode digital audio information visually in the space between the sprockets and the end of the film, or between the sprockets themselves. This is a close-up of a contemporary soundtrack containing two digital soundtrack formats, the blue area and the gray area between the sprockets, an analog soundtrack, the wavy lines, sort of to the right, and a dashed line control track on the far right for a DTS sound system, which employs separate soundtrack discs on CD-ROM. That's known as a quad soundtrack. The next thing that I'm going to talk about, having covered sort of the basics of the format, is a general view of workflows for film production using traditional analog methods. And this is a really critical part about what we'll be talking about in the next few days. Because creating film works, making new exhibition copies, and preserving older works involves a very carefully controlled series of duplications. Because these are analog and photochemical works and not digital works, each step necessarily involves change. Making a photochemical duplication of a photochemical work, it is simply not possible to make an exact copy. Each step involves change. Managing this type of change through the process of copying is essential to properly conserving and thus properly exhibiting these works. And I've just realized I've misplaced one slide with a final thing about the physical properties. It's emulsion position, which is a lot of times elided over in talking about film, but is, is important. As a characteristic of film, it's the emulsion position or wind. If you look at a piece of motion picture film through the base, and the image is correctly oriented, it is B-wind. This is a critical thing to know because the placement of the emulsion in relationship to the projection, the lens through which it is shot, is essential, first of all, to identifying film elements if their history is not clear. For example, 16mm camera original is always B-wind. It also comes into play in focusing during projection, because projection means focusing on the emulsion side, and even a very small difference in the distance between the lens and the emulsion does affect the quality of the projected image. Maurice will momentarily, as you saw from that calendar alarm, talk about a contemporary workflow for creating film works that involves processes that are digital as well as analog. Jeffrey and Doug are talking about the process of creating slide copies using available technologies. But to set the framework for that, I'm going to talk about a traditional pre-digital workflow that today might sort of be called the Tacit Dedine process, because she's one of the few people still working in a fully traditional analog modal. There are certainly others. She's the one who's, I think, best known in this context, where the shooting, the editing, and the printing of the film is done using film elements only. So I'll talk about a traditional film workflow, in this case specifically talking about a negative workflow, although you can also shoot with film as with slide a camera original positive reversal. And what you really need to think about in terms of duplication is that it is, generally speaking, an alternating process between a positive image and a negative image. A filmmaker would create a work print from the original camera negative, which is a low-quality, cheap, positive copy of all raw footage that was shot, which would then be used for the purposes of editing. The work print and a separate soundtrack would be edited on a flatbed editor like this Steenbeck. A work print was essential because it could be cut and handled repeatedly, becoming heavily worn without damaging the original negative elements. Once the work print is edited, the editor or a special negative cutter would use edge code numbers as printed along the edge of the negative, along the work print, match them back to corresponding numbers along the edges of the negative, and cut the original negative itself. From the inner negative, the cut negative could be used to create an interpositive, which could then be used to create an internegative. You're seeing some examples of them here. These two elements, the internegative, or the interneg, sometimes abbreviated as IN, certainly in writing, and a soundtrack negative would be used to create a positive print. Color values, contrast, and exposure through this process, particularly in striking print, are controlled through a painstaking, difficult, and sometimes frustrating process known as timing in the States and grading in Britain. Now, that entails a highly skilled, one hopes, color timer at the production lab who manipulates, among other things, the levels of light that reaches the film in the printer in order to control the look of film. In their presentations, Janice and Ross will be delving into more depth about this process with examples of the final product and some of the ways in which choices made in that process affect the final look of the film. It's an extremely important part of the process, and it is extremely difficult in many cases. So again, the process of film creation is a continuing series of analog duplications. And as most of you certainly realize, duplicating film using analog methods introduces change into the image. Those changes can introduce unwanted change, color shifts, unacceptable contrast, unacceptable levels of grain, and other anomalies. It can, however, be managed to migrate the film forward through its life in a way that represents the original work accurately. It can also be used to take a damaged original that's faded or maybe otherwise compromised and create new exhibition copies and preservation materials that much more accurately reflect its original state, despite what's ever happened to it over the course of its life. I've gone quickly in order to try to leave some time for questions, and I hope that I've covered the basics, and I'm happy to answer more questions. These are the two best resources that I can recommend in this context. There are a lot of good resources about the basics of film preservation and about how that how that can be approached from the position of the artist or independent filmmaker. The NFPF guide is terrific, and Bill Brand's book, handbook on self-preservation, which has a really complicated URL, but it's very easy to find via Google, are the two that I would absolutely point to as essential reading if you want to delve into this more deeply. With that, I'd like to see if there are questions or points that we would like to discuss. Thanks. No? Wow, I did a really good job. No? All right then.
I've got one.
Oh, you do? Good.
Jeff, on the anamorphic process, was anamorphic used before other processes of widescreen? Was that the first one? I mean, there was Cinerama, but
Cinerama was 3-panel, right? 3-panel, 3-projector. There were earlier formats in the very earliest days of motion pictures, and
Like
then
Napoleon.
briefly in the 20s, but those were wide film. There was a 70 millimeter process that was used in the late 20s at Fox and a few other large formats. And the process, scope was developed in the 20s, but it was the first to achieve really wide, no pun intended, usage in the 50s, because it required so little conversion in the camera and in the booth. All you needed to do basically was change lenses and build a new screen,
Right.
as opposed to something like the original VistaVision format, which was horizontal and required completely new equipment, or 70 millimeter, which obviously required completely new equipment as well.
Right. And there is advantage to anamorphic in as compared to other scopes that are just letterbox. No, letterbox isn't the right word, but
That are cropped? Yeah.
Crop. Yeah, because it gives you a wider, it gives you more surface area, so it's clearer, or no?
I think that each has its advantages and disadvantages, and there might be some people in the audience who might be a little better qualified than I to be more specific about it. I think, if you think about, and this is especially visible in really early scope, you think about, you're stretching it out, you're really asking the same amount of film to do a lot more work, and so it can increase grain. But if there are others out there who have more technical expertise than I.
If you could just comment on the gauges where Super 16 falls.
Super 16 is basically the 16 millimeter equivalent of Super 8. It is 16 millimeter stock with a larger picture area and smaller perfs. Yes, Maurice?
Actually, the perfs, 16 millimeter stock, Super 16 and regular 16 is actually the same with stock. The difference is on standard 16, you would have perfs on both sides of the film. On Super 16, you only have perfs on one side of film, and it's basically shot out to the area where the soundtrack would occupy.
Would be, otherwise.
Also, you need a special part of the projector. You can't just run a Super 16 on a regular.
Actually, that's true. If you actually put Super 16 on a standard 16 projector, you're actually going to cut off part of the image on one side, and you would have to actually modify the projector to run Super 16.
And I'm learning that, like IP, never really commercially marketed a Super 16 projector. You had to ask them to modify one for you. Comment on that?
Well, we could actually on the workshop tomorrow there, I'm going to bring out a projector there that actually was modified to be able to do Super 16 and regular 16. So it is doable.
Yeah.
On your tested Dean strips that Joanna made, you can actually see kind of the image is bleeding a little over if you wanted to show people.
Thank you. There
Yeah,
you
like
go.
the internet one, you can kind of
Yeah, they
see
do.
how it's curved. This is kind of like, if it went all the way, this would be
Yeah.
kind of what Super 16.
Thank you. Actually, there's somebody back there. The digital sound, 1990s, yes. Anything else? Great, thanks.